Good morning, everyone. I think we will go ahead and get started, and if other people come in, they come in. Today, our webinar is going to be Zen and the Art of Troubleshooting. So we are going to show you some tips and tricks and different things, some different tools that you can use within OnBase to troubleshoot problems your users might be having. I am Jennifer Henquinet, and I will be presenting today along with Andy. Andy is our newest member of the PSG team.
Good morning.
So we will be presenting this information to you today. As always, the audience is muted, so if you have any questions, you can send us to the chat window, and we will be answering those at the end of the presentation. And there is also the survey at the end. We use those surveys to create for future webinars. So if you could please fill out some information at the end of this webinar. All that information is very helpful for us when coming up with topics for the next webinars. All right, today's agenda. I'm going to now send this over to Andy, and he is going to start this for him.
All right, so today's agenda will be split into 4 parts. The first part is called Get My Wrench, where we'll go over the many tools available to the OnBase administrator. We'll follow it up with What's Your Angle, where we'll talk about troubleshooting approaches for common OnBase modules, followed by What Happens When You Poke It, where you will learn some excellent questions to ask your users before you call us in support, and why these questions will help you out in your troubleshooting quest, we'll say. Then we'll follow it up at the end with the F.A.Q review, where you can see a couple of common OnBase issues and how the steps we take to resolve them. So why don't we get right to it and start with the first section, Get My Wrench. In this section, we'll talk about a few of our favorite tools for debugging OnBase. Fixing a broken thing, be it your car, your computer, OnBase install, requires the right tool for the job. You wouldn't use a timing light to diagnose a weak heartbeat in a patient, right? On the same note, you wouldn't use a stethoscope to diagnose timing problems in an engine. OnBase is the same way. You need to use the right tool for the job. We're going to quickly show you how to get started using a few of our favorite tools, and we'll let you know when they're right for the job you're doing. So we'll get started here, and we will start off with the Diagnostics console. The Diagnostics console is a Highland-provided utility for troubleshooting their core-based or service-oriented architecture components, such as the web server, the app server, report services, the Unity client, application enabler, and others. It logs events that occur within the OnBase core. Errors, performance counters, warnings, and even just configuration information can be recorded by the console. Since it works with Highland's internal debugging and logging systems, it can get very detailed. Now, the Diagnostics console will log different events depending on where it's run, be that on the web server, the app server, or a local client machine. And yes, you can run it on a local client machine, and it does do something useful there. And we actually will show you. First, you'll need to install it. And it installs as part of the server-side components installer MSI. During installation, you just want to choose the Diagnostics console option under the Highland Server Components feature. If you're installing it on a server, you should be. All of your servers should have it. You'll also want to select the Diagnostics Service feature, or the console will have nothing to listen to and you will get no logs. So what does it log? Well, let's see what it does on your web server first. So here's your web server. It handles requests from your web clients throughout your organization, inside and out, and ferries those requests and responses back and forth to your app server, which then connects to the rest of your OnBase installation. It's important to note here that I'm referring to a separate web server and app server architecture. If you run Diagnostics console standalone web server, you'll get a different subset of logging information than you get on a combined web server, app server box. When you run it on your web server alone, your diagnostics console will receive performance statistics, which is helpful, very helpful in debugging slowdowns, as well as errors related to your web client connections and LDAP or Active Directory authentication errors if you're using the Windows single sign-on provider. What it won't log, however, are database errors, file access errors, or OnBase related authentication errors. That's because a standalone web server has no connection to the OnBase database or the disk groups. It talks to the app server, and that's it. It only knows the web client and the app server. If the component you're trying to troubleshoot involves the OnBase database, such as user groups errors, or the disk groups like missing images, you'll need to run the diagnostics console on the app server. So let's see what that looks like. The app server is the heart of a modern OnBase install. It talks to your core base workflow users, your disconnected scanning users, your Unity client users, report services users, application enabler users, and of course your web server with all of your web client users. It's just the client side. It also talks to your OnBase database over ODBC and to your disk groups over SMB or UNC pads. There's a lot going on in an app server, and consequently, if you run Diagnostics Console on your app server, you'll get a lot more information in your logs. Along with the performance counters you see from the web server, you'll also be able to log database errors, file access errors, OnBase related authentication errors, impersonation errors if you're using Active Directory impersonation, and you should be. You'll also get integration errors here, like Epic, Outlook integration, Autonomy Idle, any of the other Hyland-provided integrations. They all talk to the app server. You'll pick up any of your ASP.NET errors here, and the dreaded no session for session ID error will show up on the console on your app server. If things aren't working, this is the first place you should run a diagnostics console to help you troubleshoot. All right, great. I have it installed. How do I use it? Once it's installed, it'll live in your Hyland folder on the Start menu. The installer also typically places a shortcut on your desktop. To get started, double-click the shortcut or open it from the Start menu, and you'll be presented with the following dialog box. These two fields here default to localhost and 8989. Hyland anticipates you'll be running the console directly on the server you're trying to diagnose. However, you can run it on your own workstation, save you the trouble trying to log into the server remotely or for diagnosing long-running intermittent problems. Just enter the server name into the first box. Remember to keep the diagnostics server running, or diagnostics service running on the server you're trying to diagnose. Once that's all been taken care of, you can click OK, and the console will attempt to connect to the given server. When it does, you'll be presented with the main diagnostics console screen, and if you're having problems, you'll have a bunch of errors in it. Here, all the various subsystems that the console can log from are laid out in tabs on the main window. The default tabs are a small subset of the available options, and you can show or hide any of the available tabs by selecting or deselecting them in the tabs menu. However, you'll notice there's a distinct lack of information in these extra tabs at first. They have to be configured to log information first, since if it just logged everything by default, it would slow your app server to a crawl. We'll take a look at that in a minute, but first, let's look at a feature of the Diagnostics Console you may not know it has. The Diagnostic Console does something very special when it's run on a client machine. Its use here is limited to only a couple of areas: debugging your web client ActiveX controls, which isn't terrifically useful unless you're Hyland, but it's also very useful in sniffing the traffic between your web client and the web server. It's this feature that I want to share with you because it's an extremely valuable tool when working with a low bandwidth or poor connectivity issue within your network infrastructure. So here's how. First, start the Diagnostics Console, but select local instead of remote. You'll be presented with an empty Diagnostics Console. The thing to note here is this port number in the lower corner. That's actually the port for a proxy server. And if you set your LAN proxy settings to localhost and that port number of 5445 by default, the Diagnostics console will trace every HTTP request you send out over the network. So you can find these options in your Internet settings under Internet Explorer or the Windows Control Panel. Internet options, connections, you have to click a button for LAN settings. It's in there, it's a little buried. But once you have that set up, you simply launch the web client and the console will track all of your web traffic between the web browser and the web server. Very useful in diagnosing problems. Remember to reset those proxy settings though afterwards, or you're going to have a heck of a time trying to connect to the internet after you close the Diagnostics console. So, as we mentioned before, the Diagnostics console doesn't actually log anything to any tab other than errors and workflow trace unless you enable them. So here's how. The old school way is to edit the web.config file of the server you're trying to diagnose and set these awkwardly named enable mail slot values to true for whatever subsystem you want to diagnose information for. If you're on a call with us in Highland, they'll also usually want the Highland trace profile enabled and some number other than 0 in the Highland tracing option. Don't enable tracing for day-to-day operations. It can slow the app server quite a bit. Word of warning here as well. Is that obvious enough? If you save web.config while the app server or web server is running, the associated application pool will automatically recycle, kicking all of your core-based users out of the system without warning and without the opportunity to save their work. So don't edit these files during production hours. Whatever you do, please. Unless it's test. Test is fine. The new school method of configuring the Diagnostics console uses WAMCON, the Web Application Management Console. To do so, open WAMCON. It's installed by default with the web server. And view the Diagnostic Settings button on the toolbar, right there. You'll be presented with a list of the available mail slots. You can check and uncheck these mail slots at your leisure. However, just like editing the web.config files, if you save your WAMCON settings during production hours, your application pools will recycle, so don't do it.
Also, another tidbit for you is that if you don't have the web server and you just have an application server, that WAMCON will also be installed when we install the application server itself, by itself. So you can make those changes the new school way even if you don't have the web server installed.
You heard it here first. All right, with that we are going to move on to Procmon, the process monitor. Procmon was created by the very talented sysinternals crew who made a lot of utilities for Windows for many, many years and were later, just a few years ago, bought up by Microsoft. Procmon is a detailed logger in the extreme. It displays file, network, process, and registry activity for absolutely every process in your Windows system. If you don't know what that service host process is doing with your poor defenseless hard drive, stick Procmon on it and you'll know in seconds. Procmon is not Batman, but it's close. To use Procmon, go grab the installer from Microsoft's TechNet archive at the link on the screen. We can throw this link in chat or provide it over a support email as well. I'll give you a brief overview of it, but experimentation with this tool is best left to you. It's a unique creature in the troubleshooting jungle. It has a lot of options. To run it, just double-click it. It'll begin logging immediately. You'll see a screen like this. What you'll first probably want to do is pause the logging by clicking on the magnifying glass before your system completely grinds to a halt. Then you can change the filters using the filter option in the filter menu. Procmon's filters are where its real power lies. You can add a filter by adjusting the options on the top line here and clicking Add. Highlight an existing filter and click Remove to remove it. There's a lot you can do with Procmon. This example of logging only disk activity only just scrapes the surface of what this tool is capable of. And with that, I'm going to throw it over to Jen for the OBService Monitor.
Thank you, Andy. That was some very good information. The OBService Monitor. Now, many years ago, we used to run OnBase in the background on your workstation. So on your server, you might have had OnBase set up to start up automatically and run, open on your server all the time. Well, they came up with an option that you could actually run the client as a service. So you didn't have to have that client running on your machine, logged into your server all the time. Well, the disadvantage here was if you had the client up, you could see the polling window and you knew exactly what was happening. Well, when it's running as a service, it's running in the background, and therefore you don't always know if things are not running, what is going on. So this lovely tool will allow you to monitor that service. So if you have the client running as a service, you install this client.
You're good. You've got to call out here and here.
Okay. You've installed this on, generally I put it on the desktop, and if you have had problems with your scheduled processes running or commits not running or stuff of that nature, and you've worked with me, you probably already have this on your server because this is a very good tool that I use a lot. So you can see down here, you have the name of the service. So whatever the service is called, you can pull from this drop-down if you maybe have more than one service. And then you would click the Monitor Service button. You can also see here that there's a Start Service and a Stop Service button. If the Start Service button is not grayed out in this instance, that will tell you right there that your service is not running. And if your service is not running, you will not be bringing in files if you are doing cold or dip or scheduling sweeps. So that could be a telltale sign to you right away if that service is not running.
All right. And the rest of the tools. I just want to briefly mention a few extra tools that may come in handy during your OnBase Troubleshooting Odyssey. The first is the Windows Event Log. It's the central logging and error reporting facility of Windows. It's been around with us since Windows NT 3.1. It's been a while. It integrates tightly with Windows, and as such, there are some really powerful monitoring features that you can use that I don't think many people really realize. Its integration with Task Scheduler, for example, means that you can trigger a script, an alert, a message, anything that Task Scheduler can schedule. You can trigger it to run as soon as a certain alert shows up from a certain event log. OnBase integrates with the event log in two ways. The thick client running as a service can log to the event log optionally, and the application server will log errors to the event log by default. Unfortunately, as of at least 12 SP2, OnBase still logs everything as event ID 0, making error state essentially useless, but it can come in handy in a couple of other places. If you're not expecting errors in your event log, you could trigger alerts just on an error occurring at all. Next up is verbose logging, which is a thick client option. It's most useful when applied to an instance of the client running as a service, as Jen mentioned. It's essential for diagnosing processes like dip or cold or an external autofill updater that run after hours or only give you problems intermittently. You can keep it logging, and then when it throws an error, you can go back and examine the log and see what happened at that point. To enable it, you go to Help About OnBase, yes, really, in the client, or you can add the -V switch, capital V, to the shortcut or the service command line. It has a few options. Yes?
The verbose tool is also, adding it as a switch is a very good tool if your thick client does not log in. If you're getting a bizarre error message or not getting any error message, but OnBase is actually not coming up, you can add this switch to your client executable on your desktop, and then it'll write to a log, and there should be some helpful information in there to figure out why it won't load at all.
Good to know. That can be really frustrating, yeah, if you can't even get into OnBase to try and change things.
Yeah, it makes it difficult when there's no errors either.
Very, very. It's got some other options, such as SQL, which will log all the SQL the client generates. Not super useful. T is very useful, adds timestamp information. And then the DC-only switch makes the client log only to the Diagnostics console instead of a file. So normally it logs to a text file that you specify in the Help About menu option. You can combine the options into a comma-separated list, such as SQL, T, DC only, and there are a whole bunch of other options. They're detailed in the client MRG. It's extremely customizable option, a great option for troubleshooting with the client. Lastly, I just want to quickly mention the Windows ODBC setup tools. These are good ground level checks just to make sure the database are operational and are sane. If you're seeing ODBC errors in systems that previously worked, you can use this tool to check that your native client version matches your SQL Server version, always important, or to make sure that you've set up an ODBC connection using the correct version of the ODBC tool, which is something that we'll cover later. It's also a quick way to verify you can actually connect to the database server. You know, there's always that, is it plugged in? There's a verify command at the end of at the end of the configuration wizard, and if that works, you're usually golden. So from here, we'll move on to the second part of our webinar, What's Your Angle?, where we detail some of our approaches to troubleshooting common OnBase modules. Take it away, Jen.
Thank you. So today we're going to look at a couple different modules and a couple different tools that you can use within these modules and things to keep in mind. Depending on the module will depend on the tool that you want to use. Although more and more modules are now using the application server and connect remotely, whereas in the past, a lot of the different options were more locally based, installed to the workstation. So if you're having issues, we want to know how to detect these issues and prevent them from reoccurring. So the modules I'm just going to look at is the application enabler, cold and diff processing, and the web client and server. And we'll start with application enabler. Application enabler is one of those components that can now be installed using click once. Now, it still can be installed manually. You used to be able to install it in what was called local mode, which meant it was locally installed to your machine. Well, now it is your only option when installing it is in remote mode, which connects it directly to your application server. And it will ask you for a URL to that box. Now, the Click Once deployment, if you are not familiar with Once deployment, it's an option for a lot of core-based modules. And its great feature is the fact that it is a URL that, installs it. And once you've installed that URL, if you upgrade, say, from the version you're running now to 12 SP3, which is the most recent version of OnBase, all you have to do is recreate the deployment package, and the individual workstations will, when they go to start up, they will look to the server and say, am I running the same version? And if I am not, they will automatically install the version that they need, which is nice if you want to make changes. Maybe you've added print mod and you want people to now use that. You can add these features very easily. Because it connects to the application server, if you're having an issue with App Enabler, the first thing to do is to turn on your Diagnostics console. This should be able to give you some errors. If your user has experienced errors on their machine, those errors should then show up on the Diagnostics console, and in some cases with more information behind them. Now, if you are using App Enabler to index, A good question to ask or a good thing to find out from your users is nothing scraping? Is it scraping the wrong values? Is the components running? If the components are not running, it's not going to scrape anything at all. So that is at least a good place to start. If it's scraping the wrong values, it will be a good thing to keep in mind is see if the application has changed. If the third-party application has the values in a different place on the screen than they were before, it could very well scrape the wrong values or scrape values and put them in different places on your machine where, it may now be scraping a date and putting that into the invoice field when it should be the invoice number. So if that's the case, then you need to reconfigure your app enabler to pick those values up from the right places. And the viewer. A lot of people use App Enabler to view documents from OnBase. So within their third-party application, they can hit F10 or double-click, and it will pull in all of the OnBase documents for a specific invoice number or a specific customer number or any of that information. So it's good to, when they go ahead and click the button, double-click or F10, are they getting nothing? Or is it returning a message that says no documents? And if it is returning the message that says no documents, should there actually be documents coming back? And if that's the case, we need to look at you then again need to look at the configuration of App Enabler and definitely verify that the screens have not changed. And then from there, maybe make some configuration changes. Cold and dip processing. So just like anything else, it's good to know whether, okay, so did it run at all? Did it not run? Are the files still in the directory that it's supposed to be pulling them from? Or are they gone and are they sitting in the errors file? If they're in the errors file directory, then obviously something happened while it was trying to process the document. A good thing to keep in mind is that the account running the process needs to have access to that location. If that access to that location has been changed and that user no longer has access, they will no longer be able to pull those files, and in that turn, nothing will process. So is this being run by a scheduled process, or are you running it manually? So if you're running it manually and it doesn't run, that's where you're going to want to use verbose to figure out what's going on, that Andy just talked about. If you are running it as a scheduled process, we then want to use OBService, or we want to verify a few things. Is the service running? If the service is not running, then can we start the service? Well, if you start the service and you get an error message, okay, did a password change? Is the domain password still valid? I have seen it where the domain password hasn't changed, but for some reason the service doesn't like it anymore. And just going into that service, looking at the properties and changing the password to what it was, to what it still is, will be enough to allow the service to start. So that's something to keep in mind when you are looking at that. Plus, if the service running or the client running as a service is created in either the configuration module or the client module. So, and generally, in a lot of cases, you either have an account that's running it exclusively, or you use the manager account from OnBase. Well, if you've decided that you want to change your manager account every 90 days, and that manager account is running the scheduled process, you need to make sure that you go into that service, stop the service, re-enter the manager password, and restart the service, or it's not going to run properly and pick up your files. Are the documents going into workflow? In some cases, your dip and cold processing those files then go into a workflow where stuff happens on them. And if the initial queue has system work on it, this could also cause a problem, depending on, obviously depending on your situation. If something happens and the system work can't finish or can't do what it needs to do, or it doesn't have rights as the user that is running the service, then this could very well stop your dip and code from processing, because when it tries to go and put it into workflow, it fails. So that's also another thing to keep in mind when using dip and cold, and if you're having a problem with it. And now the web server and client. It's important to know what client you're using for the web client. There's an ActiveX client, an HTML client, and a Java client. Most people use the ActiveX, but a lot more people are leaving the ActiveX client and going to the HTML or the Java client. These have a little bit less overhead, but they also don't allow you to do as many. You don't have as many options as you do with the ActiveX client. But it is important to remember there's always things to keep in mind if your client will not load. So if your users are trying to go to the client and maybe they've never been to the client before, or they have and now something is not working, it's good to remember that you want the pop-up blocker turned off. In some environments, the website needs to be in the trusted sites. In most environments, there's probably some environments out there where it doesn't matter, but for the most part, it needs to be in trusted sites. And then another thing to keep in mind is that we have seen numerous times where the toolbars that lovely software wants you to install, when you go to install, say, Adobe Flash, and they want you to install the Google toolbar. Sometimes these toolbars can prohibit the ActiveX controls and things from working in the web client. So it is a good idea to at least disable all of those toolbars and keep them to a minimum using the web client. They can cause some issues with your web client.
It's a good point. Just in general, you want to try and keep browser toolbars off your machines as much as possible. I'm sure everybody knows that. I mean, it's hard to get away from them sometimes. Like even the Java updates now try to install an Ask toolbar every single time there's a Java update. It's really frustrating. But yeah, keep those toolbars off your browsers.
Yep. And then because the web client is connecting to the application server, the Diagnostics console can provide some information for you too in the event that things are not working right. So now we're going to talk about, well, what happens when you poke it. So here are some great things to remember and things to ask, and probably things that we are going to ask you if you call us.
These are leading questions you can ask your users that will make you look brilliant and reduce your troubleshooting time. Troubleshooting, is all about asking the right questions. A simple issue sometimes can be solved just by your end users themselves, just by asking them a few well-placed leading questions, such as, you ask these questions to aid in your process of elimination. They'll help you deduce whether the issue is the fault of your server, the workstation, the user's profile on the workstation, the Citrix server, is it the environment on the Citrix server, is it your network connection? These will definitely help in troubleshooting. Jen's favorite is, has this ever worked? Why is that your favorite, Jen?
Well, because a lot of times people will, you will think they have used it for a long time, and then you found out that this is the first time they've ever tried to access it a certain way or access it at a certain point in time. So it's good to know, okay, was this working yesterday and now it's not working today? Another thing is because maybe an update. Windows updates are notorious for putting stuff on your machine. And most recently, IE10, which is currently not yet supported with OnBase. So we here saw an error with one of our e-forms that was giving us an error saying that we had the wrong amount of digits for a date. And it was all because IE10 got automatically installed. So it's good to know if it has ever worked, and when did this behavior start? Did something happen? Did you get a Windows update? Did somebody make Active Directory changes? Were you able to log in on Friday and all of a sudden you come in Monday and now you get an error message that says you don't belong to any groups? Well, obviously your account got removed from some Active Directory groups. So it's always good to know, have some background to what for what is happening within your organization. Is anyone else experiencing this issue? If this Andy pointed out before, the biggest thing is deducting down to, is it behavior for everyone? Okay, is it on someone's machine? If they log into another machine, does the same thing happen? Okay, well, if it does, then maybe it's that user's client, or maybe it's that user's profile, and not necessarily the workstation itself. Mm-hmm. Do they have roaming profiles? These are all good things to know, and a lot of them you yourself will know, being in the IT department. When was the last time an IIS reset happened? Did somebody make some changes and then an IIS reset happened overnight, and now your users are experiencing a problem? It could be due to whatever configuration change you made, or did somebody do an IIS reset in the middle of the day and it kicked everybody out?
And it can go the other way too. Did somebody add a few doc types and forget to do an IIS reset? Oh, I can't find these doc types. Well, yeah, because OnBase doesn't know they're there yet. You have to reset your IIS server.
Yeah. And it's good to know, if error messages can sometimes be very helpful. So are they getting a message? Is there a message? What is the message? Can you give me screenshots for the message? Those are all good things to get from your users, and are probably things we are going to ask you once you've called us.
The actual message, the key here is the actual message, like, oh, well, it's giving me a transaction log message. Well, that's not helpful. There's a transaction log in OnBase, and there's a transaction log in your database server. They're two very different things, and they have two very different solutions. Actual screenshots of the error or copy and paste the error text into an email helps immensely in troubleshooting.
So now we're going to talk about some frequently asked questions. Now, we have, there are many frequently asked questions over the span of time that we've been working with the system. So I'm just going to go over a few today that we encounter quite often. And another thing to remember is your modular reference guides that are out on the OnBase community. Or the Highland community site. We actually have a link on a further slide to those, or to the Highland site. Modular reference guides have a lot of information in them, and if you're wanting to see what a certain setting will do, or a certain thing that you see in the web doc config, there are many, there's a web server admin guide out there, there's a client admin guide out there, so those guides are very, very helpful in trying to troubleshoot or look at errors that you're having.
If you haven't used the MRGs yet, it'll go through all of the phases of using a module, from setting it up, using it, administering it, and some basic troubleshooting tips. The MRGs are really, really helpful.
They and each of them generally has a best practices section of it too, which is also very good for if you're trying to optimize your system. So the first one we're going to talk about is ActiveX controls in your Internet Explorer. So,
oh, if I had a nickel for every time ActiveX controls had a problem.
Yeah. Well, that's the big thing about ActiveX controls, because they're actually trying to load data to your actual workstation. So like we talked about before, you want to make sure your pop-up blocker is turned on. You want to make sure turned off. You want to make sure it's not on. If it is on, it will be the first thing to block your ActiveX controls from trying to load. Multiple versions of ActiveX controls. Now, this has gotten better within time. This used to be a bigger issue in older versions where you didn't want to have more than one version running on or installed on your machine at a time. It has become less of an issue, but if you have a specific workstation that is having issues, it's very good to go into your either System32 directory if you are using a 32-bit operating system, or your sysfile64 directory if you are using a 64-bit operating system, because that's where the files will be installed. So if you just type in OBX star and you look for all those files, those are your ActiveX controls. And if you you can set up that view to give you the version number at the end, and you want to make sure that they are all the version of the client the web client you are running. So for instance, the most recent version right now is 12.03.217. So you want to make sure that all of your ActiveX controls are that version. And if they are not, you want to remove the ones that are an older version.
The hardest part about multiple versions of your ActiveX controls is that sometimes when you log into your web page, it'll load the new version. Sometimes it won't. It depends on your user rights. It depends on the phase of the moon, how Windows is feeling that day. The hardest part is knowing, is knowing that this is the problem, that you've got multiple versions in there. The easiest way to fix it, just go into that System32 or sysfile64 folder and just clear them out, run the web client again. It'll download the correct versions. Start from ground zero.
Yeah, and if they can't, when they're trying to load, you get error messages, that is a good indication that the client user that is logged in does not have access to do that. And if that is the case, if they cannot write to one of these two directories, then you want to install them manually, which can be installed from the client-side installer.
Or, give it one more click.
Or, yes.
Or the client setup page, which is here. On your web server, you go to your server name /appnets or whatever you called your web server /clients.aspx. This is an excellent page if you're having trouble with your ActiveX controls. It does nothing but load the ActiveX controls. It's a beautiful thing. It doesn't try and do any pop-ups. It doesn't try and do any logins. It will just send the ActiveX controls to your browser. If you can't get the controls to load here, then you know it's a local security policy issue with your Internet Explorer settings, and it's not actually OnBase. Then you can troubleshoot that. Once you can get all these plugins loaded through the client setup page, then you can continue troubleshooting within the web client itself.
It's a great tool. So now your Citrix environment. More and more customers are are using Citrix for their users to get to their applications. So we just have a couple of tips here, things to do initially if you're having problems with your application installed via Citrix. Verify that the application works if you log directly into the box. So if Outlook integration is not loading the add-in, for example, for your customers, it's good to log in as yourself into that Citrix box and see if you can load it that way. If it's not loading there, then there's got to be something happening that's not allowing it to load, and then we might need to turn on the Diagnostics console to get some more information. Another thing to remember is that although the click once deployments are a wonderful thing, you don't want to use those on a Citrix machine. They need to be installed, the applications need to be installed manually using the setup.exe file that we get from Highland. And I threw this in because this is something that we do here, and usually if you have a web server or you're using a web environment, people just log into it. Well, we bring it out under our Citrix environment so any of our remote users can log into the web client using Citrix and not having to use the VPN. So, but a good thing to remember is that those ActiveX controls need to be installed manually, and they need to be installed in a location that's in a system path location that everybody has access to. When you go to install the ActiveX controls, by default, they are going to want to install them to Program Files, Highlands, ActiveX. And they need to be installed into the syswall64 and or system32 directory in order for users to be able to use them. Now, an ODBC error. Now, Andy had talked about ODBCs before, and this is just one of the errors that you might be getting, a fatal DB error. Another thing to remember, as more people are going to Windows 7 64-bit operating systems, OnBase is a 32-bit application. You cannot use the 64-bit ODBC admin tool to create the ODBC location or connection. You need to use the 32-bit. So if you go to Windows Sysfile 64 and go to odbcad32.exe, this is where you need to create the ODBC connection. And
by default, if you use the one in the start menu under administrative programs or whatever, that's the 64-bit version, and it will create a 64-bit ODBC connection that OnBase will have no idea is there. And you can get some interesting errors if you set up your client with an automatic switch for your ODBC connection, so it sets it on the shortcut, and it won't be able to find that connection because it's looking in the 32-bit ODBC connection pool, which doesn't have anything because you set it up with the 64-bit tool.
Well, and another thing to remember here too that Andy had mentioned earlier is that you want to make sure that you're using the ODBC driver that matches the SQL version that you are running. So if you're running SQL 2005, you want to use SQL Native Client. If you're using 2008, you want to use SQL Native Client 10 as your ODBC driver. You may not think this is a really big deal, but I have personally seen where that did not get changed for a user, and in workflow they kept getting all of these script errors, and we looked at the workflow, and the workflow wasn't running any scripts. So as soon as we created the ODBC connection to have the ODBC driver that matched the database version, the script errors went away and workflow continued to work as it was supposed to. So you might get some weird errors if you run them. It may work just fine, but it's not recommended. And the first thing that we will want to check, and the first thing that OnBase will, or Highland, if we get them on the phone, is they're going to want to make sure that the ODBC connection version matches the SQL version that you're running.
That's where that leading question of, has anything changed since the last time you used this? Oh yeah, well we upgraded the database server. Did you upgrade the native clients on all the client machines? Oh no, do we have to do that? Yes, you do. You have to do that.
Yeah, it's kind of a pain to have to touch every machine and do that, but it's very, very important in the long run.
That's why core-based is the future.
Yeah. Max number of volumes reached. Now, this is an error that we used to get a lot more, but since there's, the price of disk spaces went down, a lot of people have this now set to infinite, and it's not nearly as much of an issue as it used to be.
This is an error. This is an error that you can get if you've got a long-running OnBase install, like you've been using OnBase for a while, and way back when you set it up and disk was expensive, you set a maximum number of volumes for your disk groups. And now that everybody in your organization is using OnBase, and all of their pets are using OnBase, and all their family members are using OnBase, and all your divisions are using OnBase, you suddenly run out of your disk groups, even though you've got that 7 terabyte SAN sitting over there. Why am I reaching my maximum number of volumes?
Yeah, because a lot of our customers still do platter management. So in this case, if you run into these maximum number of volume reach, you're usually going to see it when you're scanning or importing. So you're trying to bring documents into the system, and the last volume is full, and it can't create a new one because you have it set, for example, you have it set for 10 volumes, and there's already 10 volumes out there. So when it tries to create the next volume, it says, okay, I can only have a maximum of 10. You want to create the 11th volume. So this is where it's very important to keep up with your platter management if you are doing platter management. If you are not, then it is important to make a change to the disk group configuration, copy 1, to change that from a maximum number of volumes, or make it quite large, or turn it to infinite.
Yeah.
But that's kind of up to the organization and how you want to handle it.
Have to do some process meetings and see if platter management even makes sense for your organization anymore.
Yeah. And then just a couple miscellaneous tips. The more details, the better. So just like it's, if you're trying to troubleshoot something, you want more details from your users, it's always good to have as many details as possible when you're trying to troubleshoot anything. And if you have an issue that is happening, and especially this is very important, being detailed, if it's an intermittent issue. More and more issues are happening, okay, it happens once a month, or oh, it happens every 2 weeks. Well, it's good to know the time and the regularity and what might be happening on the servers when it happens. We've ran into situations where something has always happened at the exact same time every day. Well, we found out that a backup was happening, or it was when a group of users logged on and tried to access a certain query that was, putting a lot of strain on the database. So it's very good to have as much information as possible so that you can try to come to a quick resolution, especially if it's, your database server is going down, or, something that's impacting your whole organization.
Yeah, even things that may not seem particularly relevant, as much information as you can get will always be helpful. You can never have too much information, except probably what you ate for breakfast.
And we just threw this back, this best practices in there. So when you're making changes, it's always good to, because maybe a change is what's caused the problem that your users are experiencing. So it's always good to, look at those changes and make sure that are they going to benefit the users? How many users are they going to benefit? Are they going to be more of a burden to the admin? These are all good questions to ask if you're looking at making some changes. Maybe you're deciding to go to the web client. Well, is that a good decision for your environment or for your users? And so these are all good things to think about when moving forward and increasing your OnBase environment. Here's 2 good online resources. Our Navient Cafe, which you can get to from our webpage, navient-inc.com. There's the blog at the very top. There's lots of information out there. Jen Siegel and I have both posted lots of tools and lots of admin tools that you can use, and along with a lot of troubleshooting information that could be helpful to you. There's the Highland community. They have forums and stuff that you can also look through that might have some information for you if you're trying to look through an issue or try to resolve an issue. And so now if you have any questions, we'll wait a few minutes here to see if anything shows up in the chat, but you are more than welcome to email any of your questions to support at navient-inc.com, and anybody in our support team can get back to you with the answers to those questions. Our current versions, so like I mentioned before, OnBase is on version 12, SP3. It just came out about a month and a half ago, and version 13 will be out sometime this summer. We do not have an exact date at this point. Cofax Capture is at version 10. VRS Elite is still the latest VRS version. and then Teleforms 10.7 if you're using any of those. And here's just our support information again. If you have any questions or if you need help troubleshooting any of these problems, feel free to give us a call on our number. You can send us emails. We have live chat, so you can chat with us. So any of the many ways you can get a hold of us.
Absolutely.
Our next webinar will be in July. Depending on whether 13 comes out or not, that will probably be the What's New in 13 webinar, but that has not been determined yet. And then our Navient Conference, which is in Wisconsin Dells again this year, is going to be October 14th and 15th, and we look forward to seeing you there. So here again is our contact information, and thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to talking to you when you call into support. Thank you.
Have a great day.